أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وأعز المرسلين حبيب إله العالمين العبد المؤيد والنور المسدد المصطفى الأمجد أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أما بعد فيقول الحق صلى الله عليه وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. أما بعد فيقول الحق وقوله الصدق في محكم التنزيل. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن. صدق الله العلي العظيم. آمنا بالله ورسله. To accelerate the reappearance of our awaited Imam Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Fajr al-Sharif, I request we recite 3 salawat with the loudest of your voices.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Respected scholars, brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Invite others to the path of your Lord through wisdom, good exhortation, and argue with them in the best possible manner. According to the unanimous opinion of the commentators of the Quran of this verse highlights the fundamental ethical commands. According to the Mufassirin of the Quran, this verse highlights the fundamental and ethical commands that should be taken into consideration if one is preaching religion or if one is a part of any work, any type of work of a religious institution. The verse also teaches us certain approaches and certain ways that one that one can use when one is engaged in a discussion or, for example, is in a process of teaching or preaching religion in general. So basically, da'wah requires certain strategies and fundamental commands. This verse outlines those ones. It teaches us how to do da'wah. Depending on this, we will dissect tonight this verse from 3 different angles. The first one is what kind of a mindset one should have when one is involved in the process of da'wah. So the first one is the mindset. The second one, we will examine the methods of da'wah that are outlined in this verse, the methods that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in this da'wah. And the third, we will focus on one of the categories of da'wah, because da'wah consists of many categories. Yet what we need tonight is to focus on one of the categories. When it comes to the mindset, one should take into consideration and realize that he's calling others to the path of who? The verse says, invite others to the path of your Lord. True? So when you're calling others to the path of your Lord, the word Lord, which means Rabb, it means what? It means the one who is responsible of nurturing and upbringing. This is why the word Rabb, Lord. So when you're calling others to the path of your Lord, you need to understand that there are 3 facts. Within this point, there are 3 facts that one should follow and one should act upon. So the first one is that mindset contains 3 facts that one should really act upon. The first fact that one should act upon is the way we invite should be based on steps and stages. The same way the process of nurturing and upbringing is based on steps and stages. True? Now the process of upbringing, when you're raising something, when you're upbringing something, it's a process of steps. True? So when you're inviting others, the same way your process should be a process of stages and steps. So that's the first fact that one should really act upon. In other words, meaning our process needs to be structural. It has to be a structural process in order for us to be able to invite others. The second fact that one should take into consideration is in the same way the process of nurturing and upbringing takes time, the same way should be our process. That we need to be patient and take time in that process. When you're inviting others, this process requires a lot of patience. It requires an open heart, an accepting mentality, an inviting mentality, and a personality which is approachable. True? And since that process of nurturing and upbringing takes a lot of time, the same thing should apply within the process of inviting others to this. So, because when you're inviting others, this is going to require time. So you should give them time, space, in order for them to progress and advance, and in order for them to digest the information that you're trying to say. And do not be too pushy. Because when you're too pushy, that would cause the other person to retaliate. True? When you are doing da'wah, you're basically getting people to the righteous path. And sometimes new ideologies are hard to accept. Not anybody can accept a new ideology. And you will notice the Prophet ﷺ, by the time he started implementing the Islamic laws such as Salat and Siyam, it was after he migrated to Medina, not when he was in Mecca. Because he realized that that human soul needs time to develop and needs time to comprehend certain ideologies. Ayatollah Dastghaib, rahmatullahi alayh, gives a beautiful, he narrates a beautiful story in his book, and he comments on it concerning this. He says one of his friends in the community has a son, and that son went to study in France, in university. When he went to France, he rented a house. The area he lived in wasn't that much of a safe area, so he had to buy a dog and put it outside in the front yard. And obviously that son told that story to his father, and the father told Ayatollah Dastghaib. That son one time went to university as usual. On his way back, Sallallahu Alaihi Muhammad wa Muhammad. All due respect to the uncles, but I can hear them talking and I can't really concentrate, so if you don't mind to lower the voice or something. Sallallahu Alaihi Muhammad wa Muhammad. Ayatollah Dastghaib mentions the story. So that man, that son, every time he walks back from university, as soon as he gets to his house, he lets the dog into his house from the front yard. The dog waits for him outside in the front yard. True. So what happened is that one time on his way back, there was a storm. And it was really cold. The wind was really strong. So he took out his scarf and he wrapped it around his head and his face. When he approached his door, his gate, the dog didn't recognize him. When the dog doesn't recognize a person, what it does is that it barks. So the dog started barking at him and stopping him from entering to his own house. The dog didn't really realize that that's his owner. As soon as he uncovered his face, the dog realized it. Ayatollah Dastghaib comments on this, and he says what? He says basically, a'mal are of the same kind. Sometimes when we are far away from a'mal, we are far away from worship rituals. We are far away from, for example, events. Let's say our events are seasonal. They're limited with only Ramadan and Muharram, for example. When we're far away of this, and then we come, and somebody presents to us a new idea in amal, and how to progress, and how to, for example, maintain events, the dog in our soul starts barking. It doesn't accept it because it's something new. We're not used to it. Same thing with the person that you bring him who hasn't prayed all year, and then you bring him to Laylatul Qadr. If you bring him to Laylatul Qadr and you sit him down and you expect from him to do a'mal all day, it's not going to happen, or all night. It's not going to happen. Or you tell him that now we have to pray 100 rak'at. That is not going to occur because that person is not even used to praying 5 times a day. Then you bring him, that dog inside his heart is going to bark. It won't let it. It's going to push it out. True? Same way, one of my fellow friends, Sheikh Malik in Ottawa, told me something interesting. He studied Al-Qawm. He said the scholars in Qawm, what do they call the shaitan? They call the shaitan the dog of Allah. Why? Because if you come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a sincere intention, that dog won't bark at you and would let you in. Yet if you go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with an intention which is not sincere, then that dog is going to bark. It will prevent you. So that shaitan is the dog of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So because sometimes it prevents you when your intention is not totally sincere to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore one needs to be patient in the process of da'wah. One needs to acquire patience and be able to act upon it. And the same example applies sometimes on converts. And when I say convert, by the way, I don't mean a person who's called Dave, John or Nancy and then became a Muslim. No. A convert is even Muslim. A born Muslim sometimes is a convert. A born Muslim who's far away from the ideology of Islam, never prayed, never fasted, his parents never taught him any of that, and then all of a sudden he realized that there's a reality, and you know what, I'm a Muslim, so therefore I need to start practicing. That is, by the way, scholars of logic, they call this person a convert too. So sometimes that convert, that process, that true, happens from one religion to another, yet the process of conversion happened from the same religion, within the same religion. And same thing with a person who realizes a new reality or a truth. When he realizes that new reality or a truth, then he becomes a convert. He elevates higher in ibadah. He is a convert. So sometimes the same example applies for a convert. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi says in a narration, إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ لَسَمِيكٌ فَادْخُلُوا فِيهِ بِرَفْقٍ. This religion is indeed thick. So therefore when you enter into it, enter into it at ease. Take it step by step. Because if you don't, sometimes what will happen is that the result will be worse. And you see this sometimes, this is that we face with the problem of becoming religious out of excitement. See, sometimes people become religious out of excitement. They join an academic system, they realize that there's a Muslim club in the university, they want to become religious. So what happens is that they enter right away, and then they want to take positions, and they realize that they do not have enough knowledge to be able to face and work in da'wah. And this is one of the clear messages Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to tell us, that if you were to be a part of any religious institution, that this knowledge you need to attain yourself, that you need to be able to have a good background when it comes to knowledge, so you can be able to answer and you can be able to act upon this knowledge. And the same thing applies sometimes with marriage when it happens. I mean, this is one of the main issues that marriages with converts face. In what sense? Let me say. Now obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always advises us in marriage, and one of the wonderful things is that when those converts they find Muslim brothers to marry them, because really, or sisters to marry Muslim brothers, regardless of, vice versa, it doesn't matter. Yet what really one should really understand is that you need to take your time to understand is that this person converted why. See, the majority of the time, a person might convert out of excitement. A person might convert out of a certain feeling, out of a feeling of insecurity, or out of the need of belonging. So what happens is that they end up converting, they take the step, yet they do not take their time in understanding the fundamentals of Islam, the ideology. And then what happens is that throughout the process, for example, they get married. True? Because nowadays it's very simple. You know what happens a lot? Maulana, please, Fulana, she wants to recite the kalima. Fine, she recites the kalima, okay, Maulana, now recite nikah. Well, why? Did you give her time? Well, give her time first. Let her understand religion, let her understand deen. Let her understand the aqa'id. Because then what will happen later on when you present her something? Let's say, for example, you recite the nikah and then you tell her, you know what, sister, you need to wear hijab. Well, no, what's this hijab? I don't know. Or for example, you bring a brother who's a convert, you know what, you need to fast in Ramadan. Well, what's fasting? I can't fast in Ramadan, I have a problem. I'm not used to it. Now this is why sometimes you need to give them their time. And there's a reason why you wonder sometimes, there's a reason why our jurists, our maraja', may Allah lengthen their life. Our maraja', may Allah lengthen their life. What do? They have Islamic laws. Islamic laws that are made only for the Western world. In what sense? Meaning that, let's say for example, and so they realize the fact that in the academic system here, there's no segregation, true? Meaning sisters and brothers, girls and boys, they mix together, be it in school, or in high school, or in the university. So they realize this fact. So then how do they solve it? They said, you know what? It is true that it is happening, yet we need to control it, and we need to put it in a disciplined manner. In the sense of what? They allow that if a person, let's say, has a pure intention towards a girl and wants to marry her, they allow them to sit down and get to know each other in a public place. But before you get too excited, as long as they have the father's consent. The father is the guardian, he's the waliul amr, true? So as long as they have the father's consent, it's permissible. That's number one. Number two, the second condition is that as long as the conversation does not exceed the limits and becomes flirtation, then it becomes haram. The conversation needs to be formal, or it needs to be about something beneficial. It cannot be even in complimenting anything. So one needs to take these things into consideration. Therefore, our maraja, they realize this need. Yet, as long as those rules are applied, the couple need to take their time in getting to know each other, and as long as the parents open up the gate and the door, and they're okay with it. Why? Because what might result later on out of it is more dangerous, which is, may God forbid, divorce. And as long, just like I said, that both of them are on a mature level, they're wise enough to be able to control the environment. Sometimes it's sad to say, yet a lot of people might think that it's okay, it's permissible to flirt as long as you're using religious terminology. Let me give you an example. I call it the oh brother, oh sister cult. In what sense? Is that you can say anything you want to your Muslim sister as long as you call her sister. And she can reply back with anything as long as she calls you brother. Oh mashallah brother, you're going to the gym. You look good. Oh, mashallah, sister, you're losing weight. You look good. True. And one of the perfect examples you can see nowadays, sadly, is on Facebook, for instance. You realize that one of the sisters, for example, would post her picture on Facebook, wearing hijab, trying to look as attractive as possible. And then the sad reality comes with the comments. And then one of the brothers, be it her friend in university or in school, what does he write? MashaAllah, sister, you look hot. Now wait a second. How did you combine Allah and hot in one statement? That just doesn't make sense. How is it that MashaAllah, sister, but you look hot? So this is why sometimes the conversation cannot exceed the limit of the religious laws. It needs to be controlled. And this is the reason why our maraja go into details of those Islamic laws. That one needs to take them into consideration, and one needs to apply them and act upon them. And from there on, they need to decide, and then they can move on. Because what they might realize later on about their personalities might shock them. It might be a shocking reality. And that shocking reality, anything can be let go, or anything one can be patient over, except when it comes to deen. True? And this is why the second fact that one needs to take into consideration is to be patient. And that patience, when it is totally acquired, then the results will completely be good. True? The third fact that one needs to apply and act upon is that since the path of our Lord is the path of upbringing, true, and upraising, which obviously helps a person to develop, to escalate higher on a spiritual level. Same thing with our strategy. And this strategy, when it really occurs, it needs to be a strategy that is which is a progressive strategy. A strategy that helps individuals advance. Not a strategy that just stays and it's the same and it's repetitive. We spoke so many times about the challenges from the outside world, and you realize that the strategies they use are progressive. Therefore, one needs to use that same strategy in that sense. He needs to call others to the path of the Lord, and at the same time needs to take into consideration that he needs to be progressive, and he needs to help the individuals to advance. This is when it comes to the first notion of this verse, which is what? The whole concept of invitation. This is how an invitation should happen. And look and reflect on one thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in this verse, Ud'u, meaning what? Invite. And understand how sweet is your Lord. Is that He's saying that in the process of telling others and spreading the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you need to be as sweet as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, He used the term invite. And that invitation can happen only through sweet words. I'm sure a lot of you get invitations to weddings. True? The only difference is that on the bottom it says, please, we do not accept boxes, meaning bring your cash. So anyways, basically what will happen is that these are the methods that what we need to understand when it comes to the whole process of invitation. The other part that we will dissect in this verse is what? We said the methods that are presented in this verse in terms of guiding. So first there's invitation and then there is guiding. So after that person comes in, after that you've invited this person and he came in, then the verse tells you, Allah is trying to teach us that it doesn't end there. No. Then you need to follow up. And this is why I say it is always important to follow up on those people who knew they come to religion. Be it your youth. Do not let the programs end in Muharram. By God, you are responsible on Judgment Day. And quote me on this. Say there was a man who sat on this minbar called El-Zein, and he said that we are responsible on Judgment Day. Know that the result you see, and I spoke about last night about how important is the effect of the outcome, is that it is in your hands as the people who are the leaders of this community that you keep on such events. When you see that one person is guided, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. He says to Ali ibn Abi Talib, he says, Ya Ali, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides one person through you, that's sufficient. So if one person is guided, imagine, then what you need to do is that you need to keep on these events. They shouldn't end. And you should have a progressive strategy so they can always end. And they can always listen to the words of Allah. And this is why I say, it is important, and I speak to the youth now in particular. Yes, sometimes what happens is that our youths, they do not understand the whole notion of sitting down in a majlis when it's not being spoken in English or French, for example. You know, when the elders sit down and tell them, you know what, listen to the Urdu majlis, or listen to the Arabic majlis. Yes, it's true. See, the problem is that we brought our children to this country, and we wanted them to learn English to the best level, and therefore we didn't speak to them in our own language. So obviously they're going to forget. Yet take into consideration that one who loses his language will lose his heritage and culture and traditions. It's extremely important that you learn your language, by the way. And this is why this language is the language of the Quran, by the way. This language is the language of the poetry of Iqbal. This language is the language of eloquence. So therefore it is vital to learn it. Yet how? Just like I said before, there are ways you invite, same thing with the elders of our community, that they should follow ways and progressive ways in order for them to invite the youth and then be able to understand that maybe I want to sit down and listen to the Urdu Majlis after. Because seriously, those languages are beautiful, they're wide. Unfortunately, believe it or not, the English language is very bracketed, it's very limited. It's not as wide. Be it the Farsi or the Arabic or the Turkish, those foreign languages are beautiful and they're important. Why? You will realize the Ottoman Empire, when they ruled the Middle East, one of the main things they wanted to implement is what? Is to let the people forget their heritage and their traditions and culture. So what did they do? They wanted to implement only the Turkish language and let go of the Arabic language, that they even wanted to publish the Quran in Turkish. And obviously this didn't happen. When you take the language of the people and you hijack it, you take away their heritage. You take away their culture. You take away their history. And by God, there are so many things you would be able to discover. So both sides need to come to a common understanding. The elders need to provide the youths with the English programs, and at the same time, through those English programs, be able to invite them through the Urdu or the Arabic or whatever it is. So this one needs to take into consideration perfectly. The process, one of the main process of guidance, one of the process of guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala outlines in this verse is the first method. He says the first method is what? Allah said, call others to the path of your Lord through wisdom. So number one, it's wisdom. This is the first process, a method that Allah is speaking of. Wisdom is what? Wisdom meaning, the meaning of wisdom in this verse is a direct, firm speech which contains no signs of alteration in it. Meaning it's a speech, according to logicians, which is based on 100% pure certainty. 100% pure certainty which leaves no space for the mind to be doubtful or confused. This is wisdom. It's an eloquent, intellectual speech, very firm, very direct, very convincing. Yet the problem with this method is what? Is that this method is very limited to a very minor group of people. Not all people are on the level to base everything they hear, if they hear it on an intellectual or, for example, on an intelligent level. So what this method is limited, let's say, for example, to people who cross in education, who learn a lot. Like what? Let me give you an example. There was a Maulana who studies in Hawza. This Maulana studying Bahth al-Kharij, studying falsafa, philosophy, logic, all these interesting topics of ilm al-kalam. Topics that are really deep in Hawza studies. What happens is that he lives in an area that he needs to take a boat from one end of the river to the other in order for him to get to his Hawza class. So this Maulana leaves his house, wearing his jubba, his amama, mujtahid, sits down in a boat. The guy, there's people who work this job, they're like cab drivers. They sit in this boat and they drive that boat, they sail that boat, or they pedal that boat from one end to the other. One day the Maulana gets in the boat, looks at the person and asks him, son, what do you study? He answers back, he says, Wallah, Maulana, I don't study anything, this is my job, and this is what puts food on my table. I have a family, and I have children that I need to feed. He said, so you don't know nothing about the science of philosophy? He says, no. He said, do you know anything about the science of logic? He says, no. He says, do you know anything about the science of irfan? He says, no. He says, you know what, son? Your life is not worth anything. And your death is better than your life. If you don't have this knowledge. The man said, khair. He starts pedaling more. They reach a bit more to the middle of the river. The Maulana asks him again. He says, son, are you sure you don't know nothing about even Socrates or Plato? He says, no. Maulana, I don't. I just told you before. What I know is that how to get you from one end of the river to the other. This is my job. He said, khair. Your life is worth nothing, and your death is better than your life. A bit further deep in the river, son, are you sure you know nothing about the theories of, let's say, for example, Ibn Sina? He says, Maulana, no. Don't you understand? I just told you that this is my job and this is what I'm able to do. He said, son, your death and your life is worth nothing, and your death is better than your life. A bit further, the waves started getting higher, the boat flips over. Both of them are drowning. The man looks at the Maulana. He said, Maulana, do you know how to swim? He says, no, I don't. He says, then your life is worth nothing. Then your death is better than your life. True. Sometimes you cannot present people with that much wisdom. You need to set parables. You need to be able to connect on the level of their intelligence. And you will notice why Rasulullah says, And you will notice why Rasulullah says, نحن معاشر الأنبياء أمرنا أن نكلم الناس على قدر عقولهم. Us, the assembly of the prophets, have been commanded to speak to the people according to the level of intelligence. So sometimes there are people that cannot connect with you on that level of intelligence, on that level of eloquence, and sometimes there are people that know. They do require a firm type of speech and an eloquent type of speech or a direct answer. Take, for example, one of the incidents in history. In the war of Siffin, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen gave a banner to Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, and he had him in the front lines. Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya was fighting in the front lines. A man comes to Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya. SubhanAllah, you always find these people that try to cause fitna. And he came to Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya and he asked him, he said to him, Muhammad, aren't you the son of Ali just like Hassan and Hussein are his sons? He said, yes. He said, then why is it that your dad puts you in the front lines and he puts Hassan and Hussein in the back? And listen to the reply of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya. He said, Hassan and Hussein are the eyes of my father. And I am his hands. And a man protects his eyes with his hands. So sometimes there are people that you need a firm, direct speech with them and they would understand. Yet the majority are not. The majority are of the type that Shahin Mutahhari really explains when he comments on this verse. And he says they're from the type that only the second method applies with them. The second method is what? Is good exhortation. Call others to the path of your Lord through wisdom and good exhortation. So when you call others through good exhortation, meaning what? Setting parables, stories, example. Why? You see, the majority of the people are on the level of basing everything they hear or everything they see on an emotional level. So they always have this emotional connect, true? They always want to connect on an emotional level. And this is why you realize that, my God, Imam Hussein salawatullahi wasalam is a magnet. Imam Hussein gets everybody. Why? Because everybody sympathizes with the tragedy and everybody wants to know. And this is why one of the very effective methods of da'wah is through Imam Hussein salawatullahi wasalam. And this is why the leaders of the communities need to understand that since the youths will be affected on an emotional level, then this is why they need to realize that this is the time where they need to work more on those events. Imam Hussein salawatullahi wasalam is that emotional factor in religion. That emotional factor in religion will get everybody. So therefore take advantage of this time. And take advantage of it after it even ends and let it continue. So that's the second method. And that second method is indeed the most effective out of all of them. You will realize that everybody likes to hear stories. True? Why is it that sometimes our grandchildren like to spend time with their grandfathers and mothers? Because what they do is that they sit down and they tell them stories of the past, stories of childhood, the childhood of their own parents and their own parents. True? So this is why that emotional level is extremely important. And this is why a person who is in the process of guidance needs to really take advantage of that method more than any other method. The last method is what? Call others to the path of your Lord through wisdom, good exhortation, and argue with them in the best possible manner. The last method is basically meaning what? Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to tell us that when engaging in an argument, or when entering a discussion, or when taking a part of a debate, you need to take this last method into consideration, and you need to apply it. Which is what? Arguing in the best possible manner. When you argue, make sure that you have a goal. And make sure that there's a point that you want to get to. Don't ever argue only for the sake of arguing. And what the Quran is telling you, that even if you sit down in an argument and the other party is arguing only for the sake of arguing, does not want to accept the truth, does not have a goal to get to, doesn't have a point that he's trying to make, do not degrade yourself to this level. What you do, you need to maintain this method very well and still try to implement your point in the best possible manner. And if this really gets applied very well, one would realize that he would be able to spread a certain type of an ethical lesson. Because the other party will realize that this person is not falling into my trap. So therefore, there is something that is motivating him to do so. That ethical lesson you would teach is also considered a method of da'wah. That even if you did not get your point across to the other party, that at least you taught him some akhlaq and some ethics. Because sometimes you have these personas that have no point at all or nothing at all. True? They just sit down to criticize. I mean, for God's sake, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, sits on the minbar. When he sits on the member of Kufa in Iraq, imagine sitting on the member of Kufa, an infallible imam, he screams out, Saluni qabla an tafqiduni. Ask me before you lose me. Why? Because by God, I know of the ways of the skies and the stars, the same way I know of the ways of this earth. One poet writes a beautiful couplet. He says, one who denies Haider, his salat won't rise. Because only Haider knows the ways of the skies and the stars. So basically, when a man sits on the minbar saying this, saying that, rather than taking advantage of it and trying to ask, you realize a person gets up from the middle of the crowd and tells him, oh, Ali, tell me how much hair do I have on my head? By God, this Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam was mazloom. You say Hussein mazloom, Ali was mazloom. Being amongst such an ignorant society that was at the times of Ali ibn Abi Talib is the greatest alone. Harun al-Abbasi, there was a scholar one time that he captured and he put him in prison. When he put him in prison, that scholar was patient. He didn't really suffer, didn't complain. Years, never complained. The guy, the guard in the prison, came once to Harun al-Abbasi and he told him, Harun, you told me to torture that man, but every time I try something with him, nothing really works. He said, what is he? He said, he's a scholar. He said, you know what? I know how to torture him. Just bring an ignorant man and put him with him in prison. And this is what he did. So sometimes that ilm that Ahlul Bayt wanted to present, it is sad to see that throughout history the followers were the minority. And the same thing teaches us, is that when there is any opportunity to learn and to ask something beneficial. Don't ask something that means nothing to you. Or don't ask something that is not going to be applied in your daily life. And if you were to ask, make sure that you know the process and you take into consideration manners. So this is why sometimes it is sad to say that Ahlul Bayt, with all this knowledge, that they weren't able to spread just because they were under siege. And therefore you notice that arguing for the sake of only, argument only for the sake of arguing will get you nowhere. So the Quran is basically trying to tell you that stop it. And this leads me to the conclusion of the points that I'm trying to make throughout this verse. The third point we said what? We will focus on one of the main strategies of da'wah. There are two main strategies of da'wah. There's da'wah on a personal level and da'wah on a social level. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the verse what? Ud'u ila sabili rabbika. Call others to the path of your Lord. What does this mean? He didn't say call others to the path of Allah. He didn't say call others to the path of the Lord. He didn't say call others to the path of God. No. He said call others to the path of your Lord. So make sure that you first acknowledge your Lord. You need to know your Lord. So that da'wah needs to happen on a personal level. That da'wah, you need to do da'wah to yourself first. And when you start with yourself, then you do da'wah amongst your family. And after this, you move on to do da'wah amongst your community. And after you da'wah amongst your community, you move on to do da'wah amongst society. Then only then, when you have a family which is based on a strong structure and a strong foundation, you will be able to have a community based on a strong foundation. When you have that community, then you can be able to expand and guide others within the society, or else that won't happen. And that da'wah on a personal level is the key point in everything. Allah said to the Prophet, وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ, and warn the near kinship to you. So the closest ones to you, start with them first. When you start with them first, then you will be able to expand and spread your da'wah to others. And this is why that point of argument led me to this. Why? Because one needs to be patient at its utmost level, at the best level, only when it comes to doing da'wah, performing da'wah amongst the family members. Sometimes doing da'wah outside might be easier. Yet, among your family members, this is when you need a lot of patience. This is when patience needs to be acquired. And this is why I always say this, is that if the husband and the wife in the house keep on arguing, what will happen is that, and none of them wants to be wise enough, and none of them wants to be patient enough, and one of them wants to be wise enough or mature enough to be able to spread, to get to a point across, or maybe to stop when the right time is there to stop, then that disease will spread to the children. And when that disease will spread to the children, what will happen? Those children will take it with them. When they get married, they will take that same psychological disease to the other house. And the list goes on. This is why arguing sometimes needs to stop. And there has to be replaced with something called a discussion. And that discussion needs to be maintained in the house because the kids will see this, the children will see this. And if the children are upraised on that mentality, that everything has to be argued, screaming, yelling, it won't work. That ship will not sail. And therefore, this is, Allah said what? Argue with them in the best possible manner. So even when you're arguing, let's say for example, with your son, with your wife, with your daughter, argue with them in the best possible manner. Present to them the deen and teach them a lesson out of every situation and every position. When this is acquired, then one of the sides need to realize something else, that there has to be sacrifice. Life without sacrifice, marriage without sacrifice is nothing, it's empty. It won't get anywhere. There has to be sacrifice. And sacrifice is not, for example, telling your wife that, you know what, I sacrifice going out with my friends tonight to sit down with my children. That's not sacrifice. Trust me, that's not sacrifice. Or sacrifice is not when a wife comes to her husband and tells him, you know what, I actually sacrificed my birthday during Muharram. That's not sacrifice. In fact, it's a disaster if you celebrate your birthday during Muharram. Who wants a husband or a wife like that? That doesn't honor Ahlul Bayt, sallallahu wa alayhi. Simple. One who does not have honor towards his deen will not have honor towards anything in this world. And one who does not have honor towards his parents will not honor anybody. If you really want to pick a man to marry, then look how he treats his mother. If he does not treat his mother with respect, if he does not really visit his mother, if he does not kiss the ground where his mom puts her foot on, then know that he will not respect you. And the vice versa. If you want to marry a woman, then look how she treats her father. And it is amazing that sometimes the simplest methods of sacrifice are sometimes not being applied. In what sense? Is that we look at sacrifice, for example, is that, you know what, since I'm on a diet, but it's okay, I'm just going to make one meal today. May Allah have mercy on those days, back in the days when the family, which consisted of 10, used to live together in one bedroom. And they all used to eat from the same plates. And the difference was, that at least there was blessing. Nowadays, no. There's a house that consists of a 4-bedroom and a finished basement, and there's no blessing in that one plate of food. You sit down, at least the family are not having time to sit down and at least share a meal together. The father sits in his bedroom, the son doesn't even come and knock on his door. For God's sake, what is happening to our hearts? Then we sit down and we cry over Hussein. What Hussein do we cry over for? It is impossible, do not convince me that you're able to cry over Hussein if you do not cry over your parents, if you only hear them or if you only see them walking with pain. It's impossible. If you do not have honor towards your parents, you won't have honor towards Allah. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam on his deathbed, how important this is, on his deathbed, screams out, مَلْعُونٌ مَلْعُونٌ مَنْ عَقَّ وَالِدَيْهِ. Cursed he is, and cursed he shall be, one who does not honor his parents. And that la'na is not a normal la'na. That's a la'na on the tongue of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. One who does not honor his parents. And if you really want to learn sacrifice, just look at a mother, how she sacrifices. Sacrifice is when a couple are struggling financially, yet they try their best to put their children in a good school. This is what sacrifice is all about. Sacrifice is when a single mother prevents herself from the simple pleasures, permissible pleasures of life to raise a son or a daughter, or the vice versa. This is what sacrifice is all about. Sacrifice, and one of the main things, obviously, one of the main things that everybody cherishes in this world is privacy, true. But every married woman wants her privacy and every married man wants his privacy. But this is the concept of sacrifice. It is sad that sometimes none of them wants to accept the in-laws. What is happening in this world, my God? You know, one time, I don't know if it's true or not, but I heard that in Toronto they have a Muslim old age building. I said, by God, I'll be the first person who would knock this building down. Why? What happened to our children that they cannot accept their parents in their own houses? And this is the sad part. By God, this ummah will never progress in this world. A man came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I converted to Islam. He said, Alhamdulillah. He said, but I have a mother who is still a kafir. What are my duties towards her now? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, before, did you used to serve her? He said, yes, of course. He said, before you served her out of tradition and culture. Now it is your wajib to serve her. Now that you're a Muslim, it is your wajib to serve her. You're obligated to serve her. He said, Ya Rasulullah, my mom has a foul mouth. He said, did she have a foul mouth when she carried you 9 months in her womb? He said, Ya Rasulullah, I carried my mother on my back. All my life, 10 years I used to carry her on my back. I didn't have a donkey or a horse or a camel. Don't you think that's sufficient? He said, by God, this is not worth a second of pregnancy. This is what sacrifice is all about. There isn't one man who does not know that as soon as you would tell your mother that you want anything, that she will try her best to get you. Imagine, try it, and I'm sure everybody here tries it. Your mother will never fall asleep unless you're home. Never. She will never be able to shut her eyes unless she's home. And you would walk in home. And even if you finish work at 2 o'clock in the morning, she's willing to fix the schedule of her sleep according to your schedule. And then as soon as you walk in home, all what she needs to hear is just the keys being dropped on the table. And then you hear the sweet angelic voice. This voice mixed with pain. And she asks you, son, do you want me to heat your food? By God, this is amazing. There's something that one cannot comprehend. That emotional factor in a mother that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala implemented in her. That instinct is amazing. And then you walk in home. You might say no, yet she would still come down and sit down and share the meal with you. Not only she would heat your food, but imagine, you would wake her up from the middle of her sleep and she would sit down and share a meal with you. She would force herself to eat. Why? Just so you won't feel lonely. And every man here knows that there are 2 people who will do this with you. Your mother and your daughter. Your wife, maybe. That might happen. That might happen. But mainly your mother and your daughter. That emotional factor. So what happens in this world that when as soon as the in-laws come, hell breaks loose. No, they cannot live in my house. I do not accept them in my house. And they start putting rules and regulations. Not only you should accept those in-laws and treat them like your parents in your house, yet you should thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He is in fact giving you an opportunity to do this type of ibadah. This type of ibadah by God is the best type of ibadah that gets you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then we sit down and we say, Allahumma ajil faraj waliyik. How? Imam Mahdi says, tell my Shias, he said to one of my scholars, to one of those scholars, one of these scholars, tell my Shias that there are 3 ways for them to get close to me. Honoring their parents, number 1. Imagine, this is what gets you closer to Imam al-Zaman. You want to see Imam Mahdi in your dream? Then make sure that you kiss the foot of your mother and your father. Then make sure that you cherish them and honor them. This is when you see Imam Mahdi. And not only in your dream. This is the lutuf that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second method is Salatul Layl. And the third one is Ziyarat Ashura. These 3 methods get you to Imam al-Zaman, Ajallah ta'ala Fajr Sharif. When you sit down and you remember and you read into the seerah of Ahlul Bayt, apply it to your life. Know that this is the type of sacrifice that should happen. That sacrifice that you need to accept your spouse's parents. And you need to cherish them and respect them. And this is what the respect of the parents is all about. This is what we call sacrifice. Sacrifice is not something else. Sacrifice is when Imam Mahdi comes to you and he tells you, I want your son. Sacrifice is when Imam Mahdi comes to you, when he reappears and says, I want your wealth and what you own. Sacrifice is the sacrifice of Qasim when his father told him to sacrifice himself. Imagine raising a child to die. Who can handle this? Can any person in this world handle this? You raise a son. The reason for you to raise him is actually for him to die. By God, what a sacrifice of a father this is. Or what a sacrifice of a mother, which is al-Baneen. When Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam tells her imagine, the reason that he married al-Baneen is to get Abbas so he can be a martyr. Isn't this a great sacrifice? A woman who knows that she's going to marry Ali ibn Abi Talib to get a son. And what kind of a son? Not a normal son. Qamar Bani Hashim. A Qamar who is going to die. This is what sacrifice is. Sacrifice is nothing else. Sacrifice is when you let go of the most thing that you love and you need. Anything else is not sacrifice. Anything else which is optional, don't dare to say that you sacrificed. Sacrifice is that look at your mother and look at the mothers of Islam. Look at Sayyida Zainab alayha salam. When you remember patience and sacrifice, by God there's a definition for them. Sayyida Zainab. Just look at her patience and sacrifice on the land of Karbala. Look at the patience and sacrifice of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. When he stood alone and Qasim alayhi salam appeared to him. And he said, oh my father, oh my uncle Hussein, I heard you say, is there anybody to support us? Ala hal min nasir yansur. Imam Hussein alayhi salam looks at Qasim and he said, my son Qasim, and he drops a tear. And he said, oh my son Qasim, you're the only thing remaining that reminds me of my brother Hassan. So therefore please go back to your mother Ramla. The narration says that Al-Qasim alayhi salam went back to the tent. He entered the tent and he sat down in the corner of the tent and he's sitting down sad. And then he remembers that his father had a ta'weed wrapped around his shoulder. And he told him, oh son Qasim, when you get into any type of trouble, make sure that you open this ta'weed and you act upon it. Qasim alayhi salam opens it and he reads it. And you know what it says? It says, from Al-Hasan to his son Qasim. Ya Allah. Oh my son Qasim, a day will come that you will stand on the land of Karbala looking at your uncle Hussein all by himself, asking for anyone to support him and no one will. Oh Qasim, when you get to such a day, then make sure that you rush to your uncle Hussein and you sacrifice yourself before him. And Qasim alayhi salam, took this letter and ran to Imam Hussein with joy. And then he gives the letter to Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein alayhi salam looks at this letter. What does this letter remind him of? The liver of Al-Hasan alayhi salam, the poison of Al-Hasan alayhi salam. And then he reads the letter, and then he kisses the letter and he puts it on his head. And he said, oh Qasim, if that was the will from your father for you to me, then I have a will from your father from me to you. And he said, what is it, oh uncle? He said, come with me, oh Qasim. He enters to the tent and he opens a box and he takes out the amama of Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam. He wraps it around the head of Qasim and then he takes out the garment of Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam and the abaya and he dresses Al-Qasim with it. Then he takes the sword of Imam Al-Hasan and he gives it to Qasim. And he said, oh Qasim, this is the inheritance of your father, Oh Hussein, one who inherits at least enjoys the inheritance. And then Al-Qasim alayhi salam comes outside. The narration says Imam Al-Hasan walks out with him, carrying his hand. looking around saying, is there anybody to support us? By God, Imam al-Hussein didn't do this with Ali al-Akbar. That's how much he loved Al-Qasim alayhi salam. And then he puts Al-Qasim on his horse and he tells him, oh son, attack the enemies of Allah. Hamid ibn Muslim, the historian, says, I was standing right beside Umar ibn Sa'd al-Uzdi, a man by the name of Umar ibn Sa'd al-Uzdi. He said, and when he describes the incident, he said, I saw a young boy, almost 13 years old, on his horse approaching the front lines. His face was glittering and shining like the moon. And he had the haybat of his father, the prestige of his father. And then he was piercing through the lines of the front of the enemies. The narration says that Al-Qasim alayhi salam killed the one who was carrying the banner of Umar ibn Sa'd. That's how much Al-Qasim alayhi salam was a strong youth. At this point, Al-Qasim comes back to his uncle. And he said, oh my uncle Hussein, oh my uncle Hussein, I'm thirsty. Is there one drop of water that you can give me? Imam Hussein alayhi salam tells him, Al-Qasim, no. But since you're back now, go inside and salute your mother. For as soon as you left, she sat down and prayed that you would come back to her. Al-Qasim alayhi salam walks into the tent of his mother. He sits down in front of his mother, but was now his mother only there now? At that point, all the women of Bani Hashim came surrounding Al-Qasim. One woman smells him, and the other one kisses his forehead. The third remembers Al-Hassan. Sayyida Zainab alayhi salam looks at Al-Qasim and says, oh Qasim, stay. We have lost my brother Hassan, now we don't want to lose you. Al-Qasim alayhi salam goes back, salutes his uncle Hussein, attacks the enemies of Allah, enters the battlefield. Hamid ibn Muslim says, at this point I saw him bending down because his shoelace, his sandals lace got cut off. He bent down to tie it and fix it. Umar ibn Sa'd al-Uzdi looks at Hamid and he said, by God, I will attack that young boy now. Hamid ibn Muslim tells him, don't you have any mercy in your heart? A 13 years old boy already has been surrounded by fighters and soldiers. Let him fight his own battle. He said no. And it's as if Allah took out the mercy from his heart. He attacks Al-Qasim coming from the back. He strikes him on his head. Al-Qasim alayhi salam falls from his horse, crying out, Alayka minni salam ya amma. Oh, peace be upon you, Hussein. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, when he hears the voice of Al-Qasim, he rushes to the battlefield like the angry lion. He strikes the killer of Al-Qasim. He protects the sword with his hand. He cuts his hands off and he falls down. When they come to pick him up, the horses stepped on him. At this point, there was a lot of dust. As soon as the dust was cleared out, Imam Hussein alayhi salam was seen standing on the head of Al-Qasim, lying, and then he bent down and he sat, and he looked at Al-Qasim, and he said, oh my nephew Qasim, how hard it is on the heart of your uncle Hussein that you call him for your rescue and he cannot rescue you. And then he carried Al-Qasim. The narration says that Imam Hussein, when he carried Al-Qasim, he was walking back and his back was bent, that the legs of Al-Qasim were dragging behind him on the sand. And then he gives him to who? He gives him to his mother Ramla, lies him down in the tent. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. اللهم كن وليك الحجة بن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم عجل فرجه والمستشهدين بين يديه والذابين عنه تحت لوائه والطالبين بثارات جده الحسين. وصل اللهم على محمد وآله الطاهرين.